Evening. Would you please welcome the person that 2 years ago began to think about this night and has done all the work to put it together and will introduce us to his mentor. Would you welcome Michael Shaky?
It's so exciting to see you all, and thank you for being here. It was 29 years ago that just across here at the Christman Memorial Library that I was instructed by my painting instructor, Dawn Whitelaw. I hope she's here. I don't see her. Yes, Dawn Whitelaw. Wonderful artist. And Dawn suggested that I go and pick up a book in the library on an artist named Everett Raymond Kinstler. This, by the way, is the book. Look at it. And Dr. Lowry, just so you know, I have replaced the book in the library with a brand new one. So, but this is the actual book. And I sat down on the steps of the library and I began to read it. And I didn't stop, and I stayed there all afternoon. And when I finished it, when I closed the cover, I said, that's what I want to do. I want to be an artist. I want to be a painter like this guy right here. You can imagine that it never, ever would occur to me in a million years that I would actually get to meet him. And then to think that not only would I meet him, he would later become my teacher. And then over time, he would become one of my closest friends. The distance from Christman to New York City is, look at the book is falling apart. I'm going to save that piece. The distance from Christman Library to New York is more than 1,000,000 miles in my head. But it shows me that there is absolutely no dream you can't dream that that it can come true. It can really come true. And a bigger dream that I never could dream was that 100 yards from that library, that on this stage tonight, we would have the very man that was this tiny little picture in the corner of the book on stage here tonight. So please welcome Everett Raymond Kinstler. He's a true song and dance man, I can tell you. Well, yeah, it is really almost...
Why are you yelling at me?
Am I yelling? May I call you Ed? Yeah, I'll try not to yell. He's been saying that everyone said all weekend how good he looked. He said, what do they think I am? I'm going to be dead? I mean, I don't understand it. You look better than ever.
Thank you. How's your vision?
My vision's not very good. Not very good. What I'd like to do tonight is share a little bit with the folks some of your career. You can see right there on the monitor some of the pictures that we're going to show. And it's sort of like a This Is Your Life. We're going to walk. You grew up where?
Manhattan, New York City.
And you've been there all your life? And this is your mom and dad. What were their names?
Yes. Essie and Joseph.
And they called you Everett.
They did.
They called you Everett.
Sometimes Honey.
Honey. How old are you in the photo? 10?
Oh, I don't know. 8, 10.
8 or 10 years old. I wanted to...
This is a picture of me later when when the blue...
One of the things that has been amazing about his life is that from the time that he was a little bitty kid, he sort of has touched on a lot of very important characters in American life. And believe it or not, this is one of them. Bing Crosby, if some of you that don't know who this is, Bing Crosby. Tell the story about Bing Crosby calling you on the phone.
Well, you know, one of the things that's been very revealing to me and sad is the fact that names and people are so forgotten. And that comes along with getting older, I guess. But Bing Crosby, to my children's generation, was everything the Beatles were, and later Elvis Presley. Crosby was the premier most popular singer of his day, and I guess, without question, music to this day, as theater and movies, have been a great part of my life. And I love Bing Crosby. And the story that's here was an article from the New York Daily Mirror. And I had something that I guess today would be called pneumonia at the age of about 6. And I had an uncle who was a theatrical agent who used to play handball at a club in New York. And Bing Crosby came in one day. This was just 1932, and it was probably the last time he ever appeared on stage. This is just around the time he went into the movies, became a major. For those of you who've never heard of him, the one recording that still is the best-selling recording ever made was White Christmas with Bing Crosby. He won the Academy Award a few times, but my uncle had told him about a little boy, Everett Kinstler, who was 6 years old, and was really pretty desperately sick with pneumonia. And Crosby said he would call me on the phone, and I remember this honestly, as clearly as I see you all. My mother and father took me into their bedroom and said, "You're going to get a telephone call," and I got on the phone, and the voice, quite husky, had a very distinctive baritone voice. And he said, "Is this Everett Kinstler?" I said, "Yes." He said, "This is Bing Crosby," and I started crying. And apparently the emotion of the moment, believe it or not, the doctor said broke the fever. And then he was appearing at the Paramount Theater on Broadway, and I remember going, I really remember this. He came out, I remember I'm 6 or 7 years old, and he looked ancient. He was probably 30, but he was wearing white duck trousers with a blue, very tan, very handsome. And there was a man there with a mustache, and he said, "Your name is Everett?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, my name is Everett too." And he said, "I'm Bing's older brother," was Everett Crosby. And so I met him, and it hit the newspapers, and that it was...
But basically, they gave credit for being able to heal a young boy from an illness by singing.
Well, that's what the doctor said.
That's what the doctor said. That's right. It was good press for Bing Crosby.
And I'm here, so how bad could it be?
From the time you were a little boy, you loved to draw. I mean, that was one of your passions.
Yeah.
Drawing all the time.
Yeah.
And this is an example of one of his drawings in 1938. So you're about 11 or 12 years old when you painted this, drew this, pen and ink. And
well, I have to interrupt you and tell you because it won't make much sense otherwise, I think. When I was growing up, the American comic strip was a very, very vital force in this country. I don't know if any of you realize, but there's something called the Comic Convention, which takes place every year, I think every 2 years, in generally San Diego. I was invited out 4 years ago to get an award. I've been away from comics for 50 years. And there were, every day, I'm not making this figure up, there were 40,000 people a day for 3 days. And if my addition is accurate, that's 120,000 people who came to the comic convention who were comic book fans. And so the comic strip was it's a very big part of our culture. I'm very passionate about this. My friend Tony Bennett, whom I was in high school with, grew up in what they call the big band era, where they did he'll tell you, 6 shows a day with 1 microphone. Well, the comic strip was so popular that it affected our culture. And there were 3 or 4 comic strips, Flash Gordon, and George Lucas, who did Star Wars, said when he did the first Star Wars that what influenced him most was growing up reading Flash Gordon. And then there was Prince Valiant, which was beautiful, beautiful drawings. The word I want you to, if you will, keep in mind, because it's part of my life, is the word narrative, storytelling. It's what Tony does with his music. He's a storyteller. And I was very influenced by the American comic strip. And then there was a 3rd strip called Terry and the Pirates, which was very popular. And we used to jokingly call Dysentery and the Pirates. But at any rate, so this was a copy I had done. I guess the point of showing this, because this is all new to me, was something I had done at the age of 10. And did it influence me? Yes. To this day, I would say that the comic strip storytelling has been probably the most important facet of my life as an artist. It was growing up with that, and you have to keep in mind, and there are some of you whose hair is my color, who will remember that the comic strip was looked down as a very lowly form. And now you have pop art. And a lot of pop art was just lifted from the comic strips. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that influenced you growing up. You absolutely loved poring over the comics, as you said, and drawing from them. Well, what I was going to point out, which I think is so unique, that you recognized early on that it was a passion that you had, and you were very good at it. But your father also recognized that. And
well, there's a story, I used to be very sensitive about sharing, but I think now it's, when I tell it, it'll, I hope, make sense to a lot of you. And one thing you can do with the arts. Years ago, I was painting a man named Robert Frelke, who was Secretary of the Army during Vietnam. And he had come from Minnesota. He was in the insurance business, and Melvin Laird brought him in, and he became Secretary of the Army. And he said to me one day, he said, you know, I envy you your profession because you see what you were like at every stage of your life. Which is true. As a creative person, you can see what you wrote, what you composed, what you drew. And I can look back over really, at the age now of almost 92, look back at what I did at the age of 10 and 12, and I would have said, that's a talented kid. But the age, and I really feel this is so important, to me at least, to realize and appreciate the time at which a person lived, to keep your eye on the past, because everything we're responsible for today has happened before. And the idea of leaving school, and this is the point of the picture, the idea of leaving school at the age of 14, 15, you didn't do it. Today, as I did with my children, they wanted to find themselves so they would drop out of college for a year. Not unusual. But when I grew up, you didn't have psychiatrists. You didn't, you had a work ethic, and you loved your parents, and you worked goddamn hard. And my father, who loved me, and I was an only child, I was very unhappy. I'm sorry to make this a long story. I was very unhappy in school. I was an A student, an honor student, and went to a school that was only for academic level, but for kids with talent. And I was so unhappy there that I decided I wanted to leave at 15. A lot of this I don't even understand myself, but I looked at an ad in the newspaper, and they wanted inkers for comic books. I think it was $15 or $20 a week for a 6-day week, and I applied. It was during World War II, and so most of the men were gone, and here I was. And I went to my father, which is the point of the story, and said I wanted to leave school. And I think back on this, and I think, how could he have let me do this? And I'm convinced that A, he loved me, that he knew I was a good kid and was passionate about art. But I was a healthy kid. I mean, I played baseball. I had this tooth knocked out by some little kid. And so I left school when I was not quite 16. And I really think it's because my father loved me, and maybe he saw something in me. When I got an honorary degree a couple of years ago from Rollins College, I said I wish my father had been alive to see this. But it was an instinct on his part. And I've talked to Shane, whose daughter, Maddie, is so talented, and I said, I think most young people are talented with the arts, but what you should do, I believe, is encourage them. Give them the opportunity. And I think my father sensed in me, this is how I read it, this is a good kid, he loves this. And he said to me something I never forgot. I wish I could say I lived up to it. But he said to me when I was not quite 16, he said, you're a lucky young man. You're going to be able to earn your living doing something you love. Don't you ever forget it. Not bad. Not bad.
Well, let's talk a little bit about a teacher you encountered when you were at the Art Students League.
Well, I took a job as inking comic books. And I was all of about 16 or 17, and there was an old-timer in the shop. He must have been 30, really old. And he said to me, he said, kid, you know, you need a lot of training. Because I was doing Coca-Cola bottles. I was doing pop art at that time, but we didn't know it was pop art. And I was doing comic strips. And some of you are old enough to remember something called Pulp Magazines. They were called Pulp Magazines because the paper they were printed on was the cheapest kind of paper. But it's where, if you read mysteries, where Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, all the great fiction writers started out doing pulps. They were paid, let's say, 10 cents a word. They were the pre-runner and pre-forecaster of paperback books. They were about so big. and there were about 8 or 10 stories in every issue, and each story had a little black and white illustration, so that you'd open it and say, that sounds interesting. And to give you a statistic which bewilders me, in the late 40s and 50s, there were almost 200 pulp magazines a month. They were lurid, they were colorful. There were a lot of writers and artists who started doing them, started their careers drawing them and writing for them. And they were very, very popular. They were detectives, cowboys. In fact, there was an article done on me in People magazine, and the title was, "He went from cowboys and cleavage into portraits." Because you'd always saw a pretty girl with a heaving bosom. Nothing's changed. But it was part of our culture, the pulp magazines, and so I was doing them, and I had I'm not sure it was a bug, but I had a feeling there was something more out there. I didn't know where I was going. I was earning a living. I was enjoying what I did. I was terribly stimulated reading and selecting, as I'd read a story, what would make a good picture. Storytelling. Movies had an enormous influence. As you will see when we wind this down, I was going to the movies all the time, and never knowing that 40 years later, that Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and John Wayne and Katharine Hepburn and Jimmy Cagnes, I see you, I remember the painting. And I went and studied with Mr. Dumont, and I took life painting and drawing in the afternoon, and in the summers I went with him to Vermont and painted landscape. And he was of another breed of man that one does not see today. He, like many others, were self-educated, extremely bright, street smarts and tough, and loved this country, and loved the work ethic. And he, the studio I'm in today in New York was Mr. Dumont's, and he took a shine to me and affected my life enormously. And I remember, if I were to pick one thing about Mr. Dumont, I said to him one day, I was all of about 17, I said, you know, Mr. Dumont, I think I'm learning how to paint. And he looked at me and he said, I'm trying to teach you how to see and observe. And that was the key. Oh, I know, that was a little sketch I did of a little girl when I was about 17 or 18.
Did Dumont also teach, at one time, didn't Dumont also teach Norman Rockwell?
No, Mr. Neal, that was another thing. You know, I talked to you before about narration, and I think I referred to the past. And I am very, very passionate in looking back at what's been done before. And Mr. Dumont, and this was part of the great fun in my career, the number of people that I met that had touched on other people before them. So when I was with Mr. Dumont, among the people who had studied with him were Georgia O'Keeffe, Norman Rockwell, and so I was being fed all this past constantly. And it affects me to this very day.
And some examples of the work that you did in comic books at that tender age of 17, 18 years old. Zorro.
Well, I was doing comic books. Again, if I can ask you to keep in mind, if you will, how much the past has meant to me and how much storytelling has meant to me. I was, in a certain flash of modesty, I will tell you, I was reasonably sensitive to the fact that I had dropped out of school. It's not the way it is today, where people say, oh, I dropped out. I was terribly ashamed of it. People would say to me, what college did you graduate from? And I'd say, well, I didn't graduate. Where did you go? And I didn't go to college. Well, what high school did you graduate? I didn't graduate. And I was very self-conscious of it. What I didn't realize is that I was reading constantly, that I had a desire to learn more. And I did have, I think, in all fairness, a work ethic that I really loved doing. I never forgot what my father said. I was aware of it to some degree. And so in the course of doing the comic books and the pulp magazines, I was also doing paperback covers. And so I was reading constantly. And among the comic strips I did some superheroes that they've been revived, like Hawkman, and then I was working on a series I created called the Zorro books. They had originally been fiction, and it was made into motion pictures with Tyrone Power and Douglas Fairbanks, Anthony Banderas and Anthony Hopkins. But I was doing the comic books, The Shadow, which was also a very popular radio program with Orson Welles. And I was doing the comic book Zorro and
Hawkman.
Pulps.
Hawkman was another.
Hawkman was one of the superheroes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was very attracted to painting. And the key for me, you know, again, it's very easy for me to look back. It's like looking at a picture of me when I was 12, and I think, my God, what a good-looking kid. It doesn't mean I look like that today. So,
well, you're very pretty. You're very pretty.
So I can look back at that and feel what I felt at the time, which was I wanted to get better as an artist. It was never money. It was never to be a commercial success. I paid my bills. I had a work ethic I got from my father. But I loved working. I loved the challenge of interpreting people. And so if stories came up for, let's say, hardbound books, I was not the guy you'd call upon to do airplanes or rocket ships. But if it was guy-girl stuff, romance, westerns. Now, this had a profound effect that when I went to paint John Wayne, I was out of illustration for 20 years. But what did I do for all those years before? I did hundreds, I mean hundreds upon hundreds of Western illustrations. And so when I began to paint people, this was where I had my strength. And I was smart enough to realize that this is the area I should be pursuing.
So you were spending your career doing illustration, sort of a gun for hire, doing all types of
Yeah, someone forgive me for it. Someone said to me once, what was inspiration? I said, the telephone. That phone would ring and they had a job for me. I was...
Well, one of my favorite stories you've told me before, it's sort of like this. It's not the very piece you said, but that you did a lot of nautical things. But one day you got a phone call about doing a cover.
Somerset Maugham years ago, who had been one of my favorite authors, he said only two types in life can make their own, so to speak, the artist and the thief, because they have to think on their feet. And I went from job to job, week to week, to pay rent, to survive. And I remember going up to one of the publishers, Jewel Sloan and Pierce, one day, and I said, well, Mrs. Shepard, I was about 20 years old, do you have any job for me this week? Well, she said, Raymond, we are nothing really for you. The only thing we're doing this week, or this month, or in the future, we're reviving a book called The Sea Witch, which was written by a professor of history at Dartmouth. I can't remember his name right now. And she said, I know that's not what you do. I said, oh, sea? Clipper ships? My greatest love. And I had remembered years before meeting an illustrator. And he said, they used to call me Kid for 20 years. He said, Kid, if you take from one, meaning if you steal from one, it's plagiarism. But if you take from many, it's research. And what I did was, I went to the public library, and they used to have, and they still do, what they call a picture file. And all the illustrators would go up there, and for instance, you would have a job to do on airplanes, and they'd look up and they'd take out these pictures the way you would books. And so I went to the public library, and I took out everything I could find on clipper ships. I bought the National Geographics, old ones, and I remember they were written by a man named Alan Villiers around the Cape in a clipper ship. And I did my research. And what pleased me, and I thought about it often, I did little watercolor sketches. You see, what you do is you'd read the book, and then you'd come up with little ideas, which I would do in watercolor, about 8 by 10, and they would approve them. We like this, we don't like that, or do that and change it to this. And they took the 4 watercolors I had done for the Sea Witch, and they sent them up to, I'm so sorry, I can't remember his name, who was a full professor of history at Dartmouth. And he wrote back and he said, I'm so glad you found a man who was conversant with and understood the sea. Well, I learned a great lesson from that if you use your brains and imagination, and you have some passion and honesty, you can learn about a lot of things. And so that's when I did some of this. Then I had a brief spell where I was drafted in the
A
Army.
little brief spell in World War II.
Well, World War II.
Yeah.
And,
That interrupted things for a little while.
well, I was very lucky in one sense as an artist. The war was winding down, and I had made some friends, and I think I had a reputation that was promising. And a lot of the editors in New York would send me scripts, which I did when I was stationed then at that point in New Jersey, and I would do a drawing a week, big pen and inks, at $8 a piece. And I then would go into New York on my day off, and I would deliver the drawing, and they'd give me another job. So that for the period I was in the service, I was being published 3 and 4 drawings a month in the magazines.
Wow. Well, what I think is so interesting is you were making your livelihood as an artist. You were still taking some classes periodically at the Art Students League. You go into the military, but when you leave the military, you think that you're going to return to exactly the same life that you had before, but it wasn't the same, was it? And you tried to go back to the league and even take some classes.
There was a book by, not Tom Wolfe, but Thomas Wolfe, who was from North Carolina, called You Can't Go Home Again. And I think the period I was in the service, I really wanted to get back to work. You know, that business of service will make you a man. I was already out of school, I was working, and I wanted to get back to. And I had, I think, maybe $30 in the bank, and a lot of hopes. And I came back and I thought, I want to go back to the Art Students League in the afternoon and paint and do my freelance work. And I remember going back to the league in the afternoon and registering and starting to paint, and I said, that's over, that's gone. And I left the school and worked full time. The one thing I think as I look back, if I may, is that the consuming interest in people I never lost. It's the hook to this day that keeps me going. I'm fascinated by it. There's one basic difference, and I want to mention this if I may. In giving talks about art, you have different kind of audiences. You have a group who are artists. They don't give a damn what it was like to paint Donald Trump, or to paint Ronald Reagan, or to paint John Wayne. They want to know what kind of brushes you use, what kind of paints you use. Then I'll get another audience that don't care what kind of paints I use, what kind of brush. They want to know, what was Miss Hepburn like? I'm ready. And then you get a mixed group. And the one thing I learned a long time ago is never talk down, across, or sideways to people. My father gave me another piece of advice once, said, always treat people the way they treat you. And that was not bad advice either. But people have been a hook for me. But there's one basic difference, and I think all of you will, regardless of what your profession is, will understand this. When I was doing illustration, I would get my friend Shane, and I said, Shane, I want you to come in. I'm doing some Zorro books, or I'm doing a cover, Agatha Christie cover, or an Aldous Huxley cover, and I'm going to change you into a fat man with blonde hair. I want you to sit in a chair, and I'd pose you. It didn't matter if it looked like him. When I got into portraits, then you painted individuals rather than types. Very, very big difference. You know what I mean, Joanna, about that. You're painting individuals. It's very, very different than painting types. And an interesting thing also, for what it's worth, happened to me. When I was doing illustration and I began to get a little bit better money, instead of $8 a piece for a drawing, I was getting $300 or $400 for a cover. I could then afford models. So I remember going to, there was a Conover agency and John Robert Power's agency, and I would hire a model for $50. It was a lot of money then, by the way. It's not the way it is today. It would be the equivalent of probably $500 or $1,000 to get a model. And I was using these very good-looking guys and gals, and I couldn't get any juice out of it at all. And then I found out and discovered something else. It's all feeling. Get actors. And so I remember there was a fellow named Steve Holland who was playing Flash Gordon on TV. And he was Good-looking guy, but no different than anybody you see at a gas station or in a department store. But he was an actor. And what he was able to do was give me the feeling of something, so I'd say, Steve, I'm doing a Western sheriff now, and he would take the Winchester and the hat, and he'd sit in a chair. So I found the feeling, which I got from actors. You know, you can get the feeling of something. One quick story about John Wayne and feeling.
Wait, hang on to that.
Okay.
We'll see John Wayne, Uncle Sam. But you knew Uncle Sam in a slightly different way than what most people did.
Not really at that time. The pictures they're showing you, can you go back a step?
Yeah.
I think unquestionably, the most famous poster, the most familiar poster ever done was this one of Uncle Sam. And it was done by an illustrator named James Montgomery Flagg, who was a legend in his day to this degree. When Flagg died in 1960, he'd been out of the scene for 20 years, so to speak. Time magazine, 1960, gave him a full page under national affairs with 3 reproductions. And the conclusion was, based on his interpreting the mores and morals of his period, he was the most important United States artist of his day. Well, in 1917, my father, who was in World War I, told me, remember they had no radio then, no television, no motion pictures. He said, we used to buy magazines because we would see on the cover a Charles Dana Gibson painting. It had illustrations by Howard Chandler Christie, or Howard Pyle, or James Montgomery Flagg. He said they were like movie stars. Well, Mr. Flagg had done that I Want You poster. It's been misquoted as saying it was a self-portrait. It was not. I got it from a pretty good source, was he told it to me. But he did that cover for Leslie's Weekly in 1 hour. And it became, as he modestly said, the most famous poster in the world, which it was. And I got to know him not when I was in the Army, but when I came out through friends. I got to know Flagg, and I gave the eulogy at his funeral when he died in 1960, along with an illustrator named Dean Cornwell, whom I understand, Joseph, has murals here in Nashville. Is that true?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Where are they?
At the county courthouse.
And Cornwell was making in 1920 $200,000 a year, which is equivalent of $6 million today.
Amazing.
Flagg was the highest priced illustrator.
There's some Flaggs.
Well, that was Flagg. He was very well known for pen and inks, humor. When I got to know him in 1953, he was really what I would call the last phase of the great guy. He lost his vision. He dealt totally in the past, and old age and the lack of fame did not sit well with him at all. And he was also the most arrogant, at times ornery son of a bitch. You have to understand, I loved him. I didn't always like him. He was very unkind to people. He had a great wit and great humor, but falling out of the limelight, he had been terribly spoiled. He was strikingly good looking, with a magnificent voice. He wrote books, he wrote plays, he wrote movies, and he had 300 illustrations a year that were published. He was a legend. And I got to know the old man, and there were really very few of us who would go near him because he insulted everybody. And a lot of his old friends would say to me, you know, Jimmy, when he was young, I wish you'd known him. And I was in my 20s, and he had just 2 or 3 people who would come around and see him. And I did this portrait, which is in my show, of Bonnie, which is owned by the National Portrait Gallery. He was a very, very big part of my life, and a very big part of America, a very big part of this country. That was a self-portrait.
Charcoal?
Huh?
Charcoal.
Drawing.
1949, about that same time. And
Oh, this was the first cover I ever sold, and I think it's very, I think I got maybe $35 for it. It's a big oil painting. But if you look at it, it was called 15 Western Tales. I think it was, what, 25 cents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Just,
25 cents.
that was what sold Pulp Magazines. They were fast, they were action, They were colorful. Some were very sexy, not by today's standards. This was one of the first covers. It's a terrible reproduction. It's awful. It was done from, the sky was not like it, but it was a Zane Grey Western called Riders of the Purple Sage. Next. This is one of the covers I most hate. And when Shane showed that me, I said, why did you put this one in? What I used to do, you've heard this with actors. They're between engagements. What does an actor do in between? Well, a creative person has the advantage that I was always between engagements. We would do sketches, we would do drawings. Musicians would play the instrument or compose. Writers would write. But what do actors do? They have to wait for a part. Well, as an artist between engagements, I would do little watercolor sketches and then take them up to the publishers. How about this one? Yeah, we can use that. So I did one, this one, of the Cowboys. There was only one difference, and this is why I let him put this in, because it's not one of my favorites. But by the way, look at the title, Gun Feud at Stampede Valley. That was it, bang, bang, bang. I brought this little watercolor up, and the art director said, put a gun in his hand. And I said, it's stupid. Well, so this was added at the bottom. And you see, it makes no difference at all. But that, I think it's also maybe of interest to understand that the publishers were out, is this no different today, to get you and you and you to buy a book. And I would have to put sex in books and sexy women in who never appeared. This was an example of where's the cover?
That's the original.
I did a cover, I was commissioned to do a cover by D.H. Lawrence called Women in Love. And what was selling then was cleavage. So I got a model.
They can still sell it.
And I did this, and I brought it up to the publisher, and then they were beginning to get a code to clean up the comics, clean up the pulps. And they said, we can't have it this way. So I took, casein, for those of you who are not artists, is a water-based medium that goes on. It can cover one, you can wash it off with water. And they said, we can't have all that cleavage. So I took some white casein paint, painted it across here, which eliminated this. And then when I got it back, I wiped it off. Next. Well, this was again typical, Chattels of Eldorado. All the books, many of the books were very bland, colorless. Many of them, in my opinion, were not even well written. Now, this one was a well-known Somerset Maugham book, and very, very good. But they wanted the scene where the hero, the James Bond character, sends the girl off to prison. And so this is what motivated a lot of the books. I was also in the effort again. I think the word survive is very, very important to me. I think of this when I see younger people and they want to know about art. You've got to survive. You really have to learn what it is to make a living. And I would ask you to believe that whatever I did, and some were not much fun, I really did it with a full heart, to the best of my ability. And I found there was a great market for children's books, because what was happening, which I didn't touch on, was the culture in this country was changing. The Pulp Magazines began to fade away because of television, and paperbacks began to come in. Well, here I was, 20-some odd years old. I had rent to pay, a living to make, and so I went into children's books and began to do children's books. This was the last book I ever illustrated. It was a book on Giuseppe Verdi. That was probably around in the 50s.
Well, this is one of my favorite stories of all time that you tell, and this is about that period, late 1950s. You're living at the National Arts Club in Gramercy Park, where you still are today, 65 plus years later. And in the 1950s, you began to honor people at the Arts Club.
Well,
medals.
I was very lucky. You may remember, if you do, that I had mentioned Frank Vincent Dumont, who was my teacher. I've been very fortunate in my life to have connected with people. Not purposely, but I will say that I really have and do enjoy enormously the challenge of meeting people, trying to understand something, trying to interpret them. And I've been very lucky to have met some interesting people along the way. And when I came out of the service, I said to Mr. Dumont, I've got to find a place to work and live. And he had a studio at a glorious National Historic Landmark building. And I want to tell you why it's a landmark building, because I think it's interesting. In 1876, the nominee for Democratic President of the United States was a man named Samuel Tilden, who had been governor of New York and was a lawyer who had busted something called the Boss Tweed Ring and others, which sprung into national prominence. And so he became the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. You will find this story, I promise you, as interesting as Watergate. Governor Tilden ran for president and was elected by popular vote and went to bed at Gramercy Park at his home, which is the National Arts Club, where my studio is, in 1876 as President of the United States, and there was a recall over the popular vote. And so a special electoral college, I don't know the number, but that's for discussion's sake, say there were 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, electoral college, who would vote on the presidency and the legitimacy of Governor Tilden's presidency. So the 7 Democrats voted for Samuel Tilden. The 7 Republicans voted for Rutherford B. Hayes. And the deciding vote, which was like the speaker of the college, was a Republican, cast 1 vote for Rutherford Hayes, and Tilden lost the president. It's a true story. The presidency of the United States by 1 electoral vote. 1. Not 3 or 2. 1. It was rioting on the streets. Gore Vidal wrote a terrific book called 1976, based on this. Governor Tilden had lived in his building on Gramercy Park, which is a little square in the middle of Manhattan. And he did something which I think is quite extraordinary, and I defy anyone to tell me they do it today. He asked for, there was rioting on the streets, bloodshed, death. And he asked for 2 weeks to make a decision. After 2 weeks, Governor Tilden in essence said, I will not see the country torn. 10 years after the Civil War, I accept the mandate of the Electoral College. I will never run for political office again. And as the story said, he remained a true gentleman and servant to the Republic. Mr. Tilden died, and a group of leading citizens of the day, Frick, Morgan, Vanderbilt, Whitney, decided to create a club for men and women equally. Unheard of, 1898. They purchased the old Tilden home, which is today a National Historic Landmark. And they formed the National Arts Club with 1,000 charter members, including Mr. Christie and Frederick Remington and the leading musicians of the day. Artists paid no dues. They gave a painting. And Mr. Dumont, in 1951, found me a studio in the National Arts Club, where I've been ever since. In the course of this, the National Arts Club to this day honors people in the arts and letters. And I became, at a very young age, vice president of the club, chairman of exhibitions, and I used to arrange the artists' dinners every year. And this was taken in 1956, and to the left was a South African writer, Stuart Clooney. Next to him was a lady named Gala Dali, and her husband next to a Salvador Dali.
You have to tell the story of going over to the Gramercy Park Hotel to collect them, to take them over for the dinner.
Well, you have to believe that you see me as a very easygoing, gentle, sweet. So I know that, and I hate to shatter your illusions, but I'm going to. In 1956, I was a little bit hot under the collar, and I was art chairman. And you have to understand, I was trying to make a living, and I was quite human. And I was told that Senor Dali, who had agreed to be honored at the dinner, wanted to be picked up at this hotel. And I said, well, who's going to do it? And they said, well, you were, after all, the chairman of the exhibition committee. I said, I'm not going to pick that son of a bitch up. He wants to come down. Well, it was a question of do we forfeit the dinner, and Mr. Dali.
So this is Salvador Dali, right?
Salvador Dali. The first mistake I made was I said, "Hello, Dolly." He didn't talk to me, actually. I'm serious. He didn't talk to me. So I went to the St. Regis Hotel, and in my tuxedo with George Duberg, the club treasurer, who was quieting me down. I was really bristling. I thought, well, let him come down. Anyway, I went up there. They said, you know, we've got 200 people coming to the dinner. You're going to throw it up because you don't want to have to go and pick him up. So out came Signora Dolly, and to this day I don't know what this meant. But she came over to me and I took her hand and shook it. She looked at me and said, "I would love to torture you." So then off the elevator with his walking stick and mustache, he had a mustache, came Signor Dolly. And I want you to shake hands with me. I'm going to be Dolly. And you say, "Hello, Mr. Dolly."
Hello, Mr. Dolly.
Enchanté. Well, you have no idea how this endeared me to him. And I was mumbling under my breath, and this is also quite true. There was he said, he used the word le, I remember, instead of the. He was Spanish, but he used the French le. And he referred to himself as Le Dolly, as if he was somebody else. Le Dolly is coming to dinner, but Le Dolly is bringing friend. And with that, this youngish man, I remember a gray double-breasted child, came down in the lobby of the St. Regis Hotel with an ocelot on a chain. I mean, you can push me so far. So I said, "Well, you can't bring that beast to the..." He said, "If le ocelot no come, le Dali no come." So there we were in a limousine with an ocelot. And things quieted down, and I asked him if he would come up to the studio and let me do a sketch of it. Again, I would hate to ever think of myself as a wise guy, but I was not in the best of moods. And I was sketching him, and his mustache went like this. And I said, "Mr. Dolly, if I may ask you, I notice you well, all the great artists receive a message from, and Le Dolly received message." He said, "Like an antenna." I said, "Well, how does this happen?" He said, "Well, La Dolly have the mustache." And I said, I don't know why I did this. I said, "Well, Michelangelo must have gotten better messages." "Michelangelo better message than Dolly? Dolly have the mustache." And I said, "Yes, but Michelangelo had beard and mustache." Well, I mean this, he did not talk to me during dinner or afterwards. I was persona non grata. Get to meet an extraordinary amount of people from Eleanor Roosevelt. They would all be at these dinners, and I was art chairman, and Ayn Rand, and I would go after people to speak at our dinners that I felt were creative people. And I remember with Ayn Rand, who some of you may remember, but she has a great following, the Fountainhead, and a lot of financial people follow her assiduously. And I would try and get personalities that I felt were creative to come to our dinners, and I said, "Let me figure out, get me Mrs. Roosevelt. I'll work her in somehow." And so when we brought her down, I had them speak about her travels and try to connect it with culture. Next. Well, this was when.
So this is the transitional period. When you get to the late 1950s, as everyone knows, television is brought into our living rooms. People are going out to the movies even more, and they're turning to books and magazines less and less than they did before. So suddenly the illustration jobs were not coming to you the way they had come to you for at least a decade or more. And you began to make a transition into painting.
That was a turning point, and that's why I think of Somerset Maugham's "The artist lives like the thief by his wits." I had to survive, and I don't want to make this life or death. I was making a decent living, and I was brought up that you pay your rent on time, you don't owe people money, and you treat people the way they treat you. But I also loved drawing and painting, and I would go in the summers and paint landscapes. I wanted to grow as an artist, and I was stimulated and excited by everything. So I painted, and the field of illustration dropped out. It's culturally interesting that suddenly design began to take over, lettering, sophisticated design, and pictorial things didn't mean that much. And with the comic books, I was considered part of what they called a hard-boiled school. Tough guys, cowboys, and they went for gentler. The books, we're going to do Dr. Seuss on that?
Yeah.
Okay, and the books became more gentle, more children's books. I had to make a living.
So you go down to Portraits Incorporated, which is...
Well, what I was doing is, I was here and there when I was doing illustration, again with this consuming interest in people, I would ask friends to pose. And I began to have a group of portraits available that I had painted. And I had heard of an agency called Portraits Incorporated, which represented all the top portrait painters of the day. And I went up with my samples, and they were very interested. And they said, well, we can't take you on and list you as a member of our company until you actually get some commissions from us. So here's this story. I got a call from them within the week that a young man of 25 named Forrest Mars had come in with his wife. They just married, had a young child. And that his mother had said to him, for your 25th birthday, go up to the gallery and pick an artist and send us the bill. That's your 25th birthday present. And they showed him my work, and he came down to see me. We got along very well, and it was decided I would paint Forrest Mars. Well, 2 years ago, I had a show at the Brinton Museum in Wyoming, and Forrest Mars had one of his properties, which was 100,000 acres in Montana.
So this is the Mars Candy Company.
Well, wait.
No? Sorry. Let's go.
Wait.
I came in too soon.
And I asked Forrest, who had helped endorse the museum and support it, if he would pose for me. We remained friends from that day through 50 some odd years. When he died, a year later, sadly, of a heart attack, or that fall, his personal worth was $27 billion. His brother, the three of them. It was Mars, Candy, Uncle Ben's rice, Gov bars. So here was this 25-year-old kid. We became friends at the age of 25. And because of Forrest, who was sponsoring the museum, he said he wanted his friend Ray Kinstler to have a show at the museum out there. And he posed for me. And so I mention this because of sometimes the connections, which are quite innocent, of friendships made and restored and maintained, revived. And so that was the first portrait. There were a few high spots in my life. And I would ask you to believe that I was working every day. I was a workaholic. I got a call from, the other night, a couple of months ago, I was doing a book talk on the last book, and I was showing slides. And I looked around the audience, and there were people there of every age. And I said, one of the things that intrigues me and disappoints me is the total lack of curiosity about what went before. It shocks me. It disappoints me. I'm not just talking about celebrities. I'm talking about people in the arts who don't know what went before. And everything's available today. When I grew up, we didn't have TV. Didn't have all these art. And I was getting to the next slide. And I said, how many people in the audience here, and there were about 300, know the name of the first man in space? How many of you know the first man in space? Anybody want to tell me the first man in space? Alan Shepard. There was only one person in the audience who knew Alan Shepard.
Oh.
Well, in 1963, I received a commission from the United States Navy Combat Art Collection to paint Scott Carpenter, who was part of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, and the second man to orbit, John Glenn being the first. And so I painted this portrait of Carpenter. Now I could talk about some of these people really for a while that I think might intrigue you. What that spacesuit was like, the friendship we made that lasted till his death a couple of years ago. And Scott Carpenter was one of the high spots of my life. He was a Navy combat art flyer, about to be mustered out when he was called for the space program. and I painted Scott. He came to New York. There's stories in all of this, right down to the, I had that spacesuit in my studio, and I will tell you, when he put it on for me one day, it was put on like a one piece that came up from his legs. The neck piece went over this way. You screwed the helmet on. The gloves were screwed on. Every finger had a light in it. On his chest was a mirror that would reflect the mirror across from the instruments. And I spent hours with Scott, learning, absorbing, enjoying. We talked everything from family to language to words. He was the most curious, inquisitive man. And I mention him particularly for a reason. Hold that, if you will. Okay. 2 years later, I was commissioned to paint Shepard, who was America's first man in space. And what I guess I'm trying to say to you is how lucky I have been in my life to have touched on the many people I have, and the connecting, which is quite innocent, because 20 years after this portrait, I had a call from Bill Blair, who was a friend of mine, who was publisher of Atlantic Magazine. And he said, a good friend of mine, he said, is a writer named Tom Wolfe, who was then the hottest writer there was. It was my generation. And he wants to meet you. I said, why would Tom Wolfe want to meet me? Well, he's doing a book on the astronauts, the first astronauts. He knows that you knew Shepard, that you were a very close friend of Scott Carpenter's, and that led to my getting together with Tom Wolfe, who not only became a subject and a close friend, but this all began to go like this. Everywhere I touched, it was beginning to connect, but innocently. And anyway, now go ahead. So I'm now moving up to about 1978. Now, what I want to mention to you, if I may, is that if I start to tell you stories about John Smith or Mary Jones, so we've obviously picked names that you can connect with because they've been part of our culture. I had a call in 1978. You know, there are people, I can't believe it, people who are interested in film and theater who never heard of John Wayne. By the way, he's dead 35 years. That's a long time. I got a call, and I was getting I'll never forget that I was getting very, very busy. And the last thing I wanted to do was travel. And the phone rang one afternoon, and they said, oh, Ray, this is Rich Muno. Rich was the assistant director of the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. And he said, we were hoping you'd come out here. We got a portrait for you to do. And I said, well, I'm not traveling, Rich. You'd have to bring your subject here. I can't travel right now. When would this be? He said, we were hoping you'd come out Friday. This was like Tuesday. I said, what year? He said, this Friday. I said, Rich, you gotta be kidding. I said, I can't come out any Friday for the next 6 months. Oh, and he said, this was a quote, he said, oh gosh, he said, we had Duke all lined up. Duke. I knew immediately. Well, where do you think I was Friday night? Del Webb's Newporter Inn, sitting in the lunchette, which had these cushions, you know, these plastic cushions, banquettes, the table. I was sitting here, space for Mr. Wayne was here, and across from me was Dean Crakel, the director, his son, and Jane, and Bob Norris, who was in the cattle business with John Wayne, and we were waiting for Duke. And one of the images and sounds and moments I remember is when he came in wearing suntans like this, rolled up, no socks, beach sneakers, brown polo shirt. Not many people know he had a toupee. It was a pretty good one. But when he went to sit down, I heard this, and it was like some ship that landed in. The air went out of the pillows when he sat. And I remember his shoulder being up. He was very big. He was 6'4", but he was very large from here up. I mean, large. Big hands, large head. And I didn't know where we were going. This was brunch around 11 o'clock in the morning. And we were making, and I happened, I had a book with me I had done called Painting Portraits. And in the front I had done a little pen and ink. Remember now, I told you I used to do Western illustrations. And I did a little pen and ink of a cowboy on a horse with a Winchester like that, followed by some Indians, and I had inscribed it to Duke from his admiring fan. And I said to Bob Norris, who was in the cattle business with him, and was, by the way, the first Marlboro man. He was a cattle rancher who owned mountains in Colorado. And I said, what happens next? He said, I don't know. He said, he's kind of looking you over. No, John Wayne was not about to just say, come on out to the house. And he had been painted, sort of a sad story, he'd been painted by Norman Rockwell. And Wayne was a real gentleman. And I was told he did not, nobody in the family liked Mr. Rockwell's painting, including Mr. Wayne, but Mr. Wayne would never say so, but they wanted to replace it. Well, I have a great admiration for Norman Rockwell. I think he was a goddamn genius. Anyway, the next step was I said to Bob Norris, I said, I've got this book for Mr. Wayne. And apparently he saw the pen and ink in the front. Oh, God, that's great. Come on out to the house. So we went into the house, and he was imposing. There was nothing in the house that was movie star. It was on a bay. It was a gated community. And a couple of things came up. One was, I have to believe that some of you are old enough to remember people like Clark Gable. And something came up, it was very amiable. There were just 6 or 7 of us, if that, in his living room, which was totally unpretentious. Western paintings, but basically a man's house, lived in water. And he was just as natural. He was very much the way he was in the movies. And something came up about the portrait of Norman Rockwell. And he was very self-conscious about it. He said, well, you know, Michael doesn't like it, and Patrick doesn't like it. And he said, well, what's Mr. Rockwell going to do with an ugly old bastard like me? And he said, I guess, and I said, well, you know, actually, Mr. Wayne, it's none of those things. And he really, I said, what do you think it is? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I think it is, Mr. Wayne. I said, Mr. Rockwell is a great hero of mine. And if you'd gotten Mr. Rockwell 10 years earlier, I wouldn't be here. But I said, I think Mr. Rockwell's in some stages of, what's the
Dementia?
Huh?
Dementia?
Well, it's a form of dementia. Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's, yeah.
And I knew this to be so, by the way, that Mr. Rockwell was having problems. And I said, Mr. Rockwell is a great, great artist, and you know, to me, you and Mr. Rockwell should be on Mount Rushmore. But I said, Mr. Rockwell is sadly just losing his ability to. And whatever it was, we connected. And I realized he was looking me over because he was not about to agree to just pose for any artist. His son told me he was painted every week by somebody who sent him a picture. And they would say, this is a gift to you, Mr. Wayne. And he said, my father used to write a letter saying, or the secretary would, Mr. Wayne, thanks you so much for your fine example, showing this fine example. And he would return it to them because he didn't want them to be able to say, my painting's in his collection. But he was, I exchanged letters with him, and I remembered, he wrote to me at one point, this is a quote, and it was delicious. When I did a little sketch of him, which I sent him in a letter, he wrote me back, he said, in the parlance of photography, your art is a negative of that which the other fellow likes. Well, I noticed these letters which were typewritten, and he's then signed it in pen Duke, he had gone back and put a comma or an exclamation point. He was very articulate, and one of the things that was said about him was, I didn't know how to say ain't until I got into the movies. And we asked him once about Clark Gable, and for those of you who might be old enough to remember, Clark Gable was the biggest movie star in the world. And somebody said to John Wayne, it's a shame you and Gable never made a movie. Well, he said, hell, I wanted it. When Clark came back from World War II, we agreed we'd make a movie together. I said, what happened? He said, well, he wanted to know who was going to get top billing. And I said to him, I said, hell, Clark, let's flip a coin. Heads, you got it. Tails, I got it. And I said, what happened? He said, you wouldn't risk it. That's show business. It was not going to be Wayne and Gable. Whereas I think Wayne would have said, hey, you flipped, I lost. But he was not going to hand it to him. I did the painting. There are some lawyers here tonight, I think. Am I correct?
Yes.
I did a painting of John Wayne, and I did something instinctively, which don't ask me to explain because I can't. But it was happening a little bit. I put a C on my signature. I was paid by the Cowboy Hall of Fame for the portrait. And I put a C on it, and I remember the director of the museum, Dean Crakel, called me. He said, "Hell, Ray, you got this goddamn C there, and it's copyrighted." I did with the Library of Congress. I sent my $30 in, whatever it was, with a photograph of the painting, and the signature with a C in front of my signature. And Dean Crakel said to me, "Do you mean we gotta ask you every time we want to use that painting?" I said, "Yeah." I said, let me make it clear. I don't want to make a nickel off this. I just want to protect my reproduction. Make sure you don't crop it or it's used indiscriminately. I don't want a nickel. I'll give you a letter that says you can use it subject to my permission, but I will never accept a nickel. And fast forward. The museum had planned to use the painting on the cover. Wayne is living, by the way. This is totally important to a judge. Wayne is alive. Saturday Evening Post contacted me that they wanted to use, no, they didn't contact me. They got hold of a copy of the John Wayne portrait, and they got permission from the Cowboy Hall of Fame to use it on their magazine. What they didn't observe was that they were not to use it till the Cowboy Hall magazine came out first. So they went ahead and they published it, and I got a call from Michael Wayne, who was John Wayne's son. And I'll tell you, I was an Army sergeant. I told him, I said, "Michael, you talk to me this way, I'm hanging up." I mean, the air was blue with 4-letter words. "Don't tell me about your goddamn integrity. You go ahead and sell my father's picture to, I don't know what you're talking about." They used it without my permission, and they took my, if you can believe this, the painting was, you showed the full painting? This was the painting. My signature appeared at the lower right, I think it was, C, and then Everett Raymond Kinstler. They had taken the head off the painting, moved my signature with the C on it, up onto this, and printed it. Well, to telegraph and end the story, I felt so embarrassed. Because as he said to me, you and your integrity, and you were going to keep the copyright and not, and you go ahead and sell out my father. I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And if you've seen this part of it in a movie, you think it was made up. That afternoon, I went up to the Century Club in New York to get a drink, which is a fairly prestigious club for arts and letters in the west side of Manhattan. And I ran into Arthur Christie, who was my lawyer and a former Assistant Attorney General, Southern Assistant Attorney General for the Southern District of New York. And he was bringing a couple of his law partners up for drinks. And he said, "Ray, come over and join us." So I went over and joined him, and then he said to them, "You ought to see Ray's painting of John Wayne." John Wayne was, he was the biggest star, without question, in Hollywood. And I said, "Arthur, I got to talk to you." And I told him the story. He said, "Come over to my office next day." The gist of this was, and this is 1978, New York Times had it down that artist sued Saturday Evening Post for $12 million. Infringement of contract, copyright infringement, civil rights, and all kinds of things. We won the case. Now, the reason I was not driven here in a private jet tonight was when, after we won the case, after 2.5 years of litigation, the lawyers accepted a settlement. I got 0 out of it, not a nickel. And the case became actually one of the cases they used at Columbia Law School, copyright infringement of an artist. And Theodore White, who had written a lot of books on the makings of the president, said to me, I said, "Why would they do a thing like this?" And Teddy White said to me, "Listen, Ed, they figured you're an artist, you're a nice guy, you're not going to sue them." But we did. And they won the case. But it was copyright infringement.
Everett Raymond Kinstler is that an hour goes by in about 10 minutes, and I know that the time, we're already against the wall on time. If you'll allow me just to show a couple of things, but I do want you to tell, if you'll stick with me for just a minute, James Cagney, which is another...
Quick, let me bring Frank Sinatra.
Lock the doors. Lock the doors.
Players Club is a club next door to me, and I am our chairman. It was the home of Edwin Booth, whose younger brother, sad thing to remember, was John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Lincoln. And the Players Club is the theatrical club for people in the theater. And it's not Broadway so much as it is Shakespeare, London, Laurence Olivier, Peter O'Toole, Richard Burton, and the great American actors, the Barrymores, Spencer Tracy, Hogarth, who all came off the American Broadway theater. It's theater. And the most beloved actor there was Jimmy Cagney. And Jimmy had retired from movies, and he was, some of you I hope may remember, was the biggest star for 3 or 4 years in Hollywood. He won the Academy Award for Yankee Doodle Dandy. And they were trying to raise money for the library. And so his name came up, and a lot of these are really longer stories. I'm moving them fast. Through some friends of his who knew Cagney, he was a member of the Players, he agreed to pose for me, and I was going to create a lithograph where we would sell them to you all for $500 each, and Cagney would have signed each one of them. There are many stories that I absolutely treasure with him. Number one, I remember we were hosting the Royal Shakespeare Company at the Players Club, who were in New York doing Nicholas Nickleby, and we hosted them at the club one Sunday afternoon, and they were all younger people, 40 and younger. And I said to them, are there any American actors that you people really like? Oh, Cagney. I said, really? Oh, he's a national treasure. They loved his honesty, his directness, and as I said, he could do it all. Natural actor. There was a dinner for him when we kicked off this. You have the lithograph?
Yeah. No, I don't actually, but we had it.
All right, we had it in the room.
Yeah.
Anyway, we did very well with it. There was nothing in my pocket except the joy of working with him. But there was a dinner for Jimmy, and Jack Lemmon was there, and Travolta, and Sinatra, and there was a little private party before we went down, black tie. It was sold out. Betty Davis, Douglas Fairbanks, everybody was there. They adored Cagney. And then I got a story about Ronald Reagan, two stories. So I was in the room waiting, and in walked Frank Sinatra. Now that's my generation. And you know how shy I am, and I don't like to talk much. So I didn't know what to say to him. And I said, oh, hi. He was going to be there to speak for him. It was about 7 o'clock at night, and Cagney was sitting about over there, talking to somebody. And I said to Frank Sinatra, I said, when did you get here? Oh, about an hour ago we came into some Cockamamie airport in New Jersey. I said, where'd you come from? He said, from California. I said, you come all this way for this dinner? Oh, yeah. I said, when are you going back? I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't say the logical things like, I love your music. And I said, when are you going back? He said, as soon as this is over. And this is kind of about Sinatra. I said, you mean you've come all this distance to see Cagney and speak for him, and you're going right back? I remember he put his arm on mine like this, and he pointed over to Cagney, and he said, I would go anywhere, anytime, any place for that man. Told me a lot about Sinatra. One quick thing about Cagney, I'm not sure you know the answer. Once recently, someone in the audience asked me, how did I happen to get to paint Ronald Reagan for the White House? And I said, well, look, I painted Caspar Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense. I painted George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State. I painted, I've forgotten the name of the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Commerce. I said I painted 8 of his cabinet officers. I'm not saying he should have selected me, but why wouldn't I be considered? When I was painting President Reagan, he and Mrs. Reagan came to my studio at the National Arts Club. And she would not let me stay alone with him, by the way. This has never happened to me. She wanted to be in the room. She was so protective of him. And I say that as a compliment, but it was very frustrating to the point that I had a hard time working because he was deaf in one ear. And I would say to him, Mr. President, what do you think of the colorization of King's Road? And from behind me, Mrs. Reagan would say, "Dear," to President Reagan, "Mr. Kinstler wants to know what you thought of King's Row." So my questions were not going this way. They were going this way to her, up here, back. And you see, for me, when I work as a painter, I am very dependent upon that, someone looking at me, that I can not judge them, I don't do that, but I can get my own feelings on how to interpret them. And it was very frustrating. And then the following came up, and the reason I bring this together with the Cagney story was Mrs. Reagan said, "You know, you have a great friend in Jimmy Cagney." I said, "Really?" "Oh," she said, "you know, when Ron and I came to, I was Nancy Davis," she said to me, "and I came to Warner Brothers." She said, "Jimmy was the biggest star on the lot." And she said, "You know, he was feisty. He tackled Jack Warner about the unions and the actor being able to maintain himself. And he took a great shine to Ron and myself, and really was like an uncle. And we adored Jimmy." She said, "We adored Jimmy. Whenever Ron and I are coming east, Jimmy's always invited." And she said, "He always talks about you. That when," she said, "Ron, man, you've got to get Ray Kinstler to paint." So here I was thinking maybe it was Schultz, maybe it was Jimmy Cagney.
And you also, while Nancy Reagan was there, she made the connection to Katharine Hepburn, who you had the chance to paint. And she wanted to leave a little note for Kate Hepburn.
Well, yeah, I thought there was a book written by, what's her name? Katie Brower? Chris Anderson's daughter? Yeah. A friend of mine used to be editor of People Magazine, and his daughter, Katharine Anderson Brower, has become a best-selling author. And she did a book 2 years ago called First Ladies. And the story she's got in the book was the time I had told her when Mrs. Reagan came down with the president to see the portrait. And I had this painting, which was large. It's down in the Smithsonian. It's over life size. They've got it in the Smithsonian with her 4 Oscars in front of it. And she said, "Oh, Katie, my dearest, oldest friend. She got me my first job in New York." And she said, "The reason we were late getting to you, Mr. Kinstler, was I was driving down 47th Street and I wanted to see her old brownstone, and I couldn't find it." I said, "Well, Mrs. Reagan, she lives on 49th Street. And she said, "Do you see her at all?" And I said, "Not really. I'm not in touch with her particularly." She said, "Oh, you know, my oldest and dearest friend, I love her." I said, "Well, why don't we call her?" Now, here's the first lady, and everyone that I ever talked to, she was very, very strong. I dialed a number, and an Irish lady named Nora, who worked for Miss Shepard. "Hello." I said, "Nora, this is Ray Kinstler, and I wonder if Miss Hepburn is there. I'm here with a friend of hers, President Reagan's wife, Nancy, would like to talk to Miss Hepburn." And I was holding the phone like this. And she said, "Well, wait a minute, I'll see if Miss Hepburn is free." And I handed like this to Miss Reagan, the telephone. Miss Reagan, no, you talk to her first." She was totally intimidated by that. Serious. Anyway.
Mr. Kinstler has painted every U.S. president since Richard Nixon, including Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter. Let me flip through these as we wrap this up. That's his friend Tony Bennett, Tom Wolfe, he mentioned to you earlier. Dr.
Oh, I
Seuss.
want to talk. No, bring back. Gotta do that.
Well, you gotta do that. You gotta do that.
Gotta do this one.
The dinner reservation
I
is
think
shot.
I told. Are you watching the time? Because
No, it's over. It is over.
All I'm thinking about is that taxis that I said keep the meter going. I was working in the studio around the same time as I mentioned to John Wayne. I got a call from Dartmouth College, and Ed Latham, who was the assistant to the president, said, "Ray, we've got a portrait we want you to do for Dartmouth of a man who's given us a chair with a great deal of money. Class of 1925, Rhodes Scholar, named Ted Geisel, and we want a portrait of him. And he lives in La Jolla." I said, "Well, delighted. When would he come to New York?" "Oh, he won't come to New York." I said, well, what do you mean? Well, he said he lives in La Jolla, and he doesn't like traveling to New York. I said, well, what does he do? And they said, well, he writes children's books. And I said, well, I have 2 children. I never heard of Ted Kaiser. Well, he writes under a pseudonym. And we'd like you to go out to La Jolla to paint him. And I said, no, I said, well, what? I said, I never heard of him. He said, well, have you ever heard of The Cat in the Hat? Yes. So I went out to La Jolla and had a joyful experience. I expected a little man with goggles, and he was tall, silver hair, bearded, elegant, in this magnificent Architectural Digest house that spanned the Pacific Ocean like this. It was a lighthouse. Well, Ted had made a great deal of money. I mean, multi-millionaire. And he had been a Dartmouth graduate and had given a chair. His name was Theodore Geisel. And he came from Massachusetts and adopted, his middle name was Seuss, his mother's maiden name. And he began to write children's books. He never had children. But he heard things and saw things that you and I didn't. And he was an extraordinary, important figure in American culture. And I went out to La Jolla, and we connected right away. Just, it was almost like, I can't tell you, just as soon as we met, we liked each other. He was very much of a loner. If, as a woman, you met him, you would feel very flattered because he was charming, he was elegant, he was funny, he was private, and there was a very, very private side to him. But I think because I was an artist, and when I walked in, he took my hand like this, and he said to his wife, Audrey, God, look at Ray's finger. It's just bent like that. I said, well, Ted, that came from my days when I was illustrating, and I used to hold the brush in this hand. And I said, actually, your company, Random House, publishes all your books under the, they still do to this day, under the title of Beginner Books. It's a trademark, where if those who've got children and have read these books know that they introduce a certain number of words, and by the time the child has read the book, his vocabulary has been enlarged. That was the point of Cat in the Hat and all of those books. And I said, I think my finger bent from holding the brush. In fact, I said, the last book I ever illustrated was for your company. It was a book called Cowboy Andy. And I said they were offering $5,000, which is what I earned in a year, to do this children's book, and I was not a children's book on that level illustrator. And I said, Ted, it was the worst book I've ever illustrated. And he looked at me and said, I know that book. It was the worst book anyone ever illustrated.
As much as I hate to say it, we're going to have to wrap it up.
I'm all through.
But let me say this. Thank you for sharing these stories. Thank you for braving the snow to make it here today. It's a miracle that it really worked out. We need to do a part 2, there's no doubt, because there are many other stories to tell. But
another 80 years.
Another 80 years later.
Special talent, whom I adore this man and his family, and I want to thank Joseph Mella and Margaret Walker for providing the atmosphere and the opportunity to show the pictures. I hope you'll be pleased with the selection, and I'll see you in 3084.
There we are.
Folks, thank you for coming tonight. As we wrap up, just a few things, so don't quite walk out the door yet. Let's give him one more big round of applause. What a night. We knew Kinstler was a world-renowned artist. We now know he's also a consummate storyteller, and we're so thankful for that. If you didn't get enough, His exhibit opens tomorrow night with a reception at Vanderbilt at 5 p.m. in the Cohen Fine Art Gallery. Make sure to attend if you can.